So as we're getting set here, I have the enviable task of speaking to you right before lunch. And I know we are a touch behind, so we'll try to summarize fairly well here. But yeah, I'm here to talk with you about oxygen therapy, both modalities, and traveling with oxygen. We will focus a lot about airline travel, just because that can have some caveats and some interesting wrinkles in that. But those who are not on oxygen, I just don't want you to kind of glaze over and dream about lunch, because at some point in the course of your disease, you may be on oxygen, and I'll allude later that even though you're not using oxygen presently, if you get up in an airplane, you may require it at some point. So, unlike Dr. Chapman, I have a very short list of disclosures to share with you. I have no disclosures to declare, but I have been employed by Medigas for 13 years. So some of my discussion, of course, is slanted that way because of my experience with the home care company that I work for. Just a couple of notes about Medigas in itself, that a lot of people will get confused and say, well, are you Praxair or are you Medigas? And we are talking about the same company. Praxair is the industrial gas company, and Medigas is the healthcare division of Praxair Canada. So you can see there that we have over 70 locations across the country. So certainly if you are traveling, we're able to really take care of things for you because of that. We are a leader in home care for respiratory needs because of that. Home oxygen therapy, it's what we do. We've been working for over 45 years in conjunction with physicians and nurse practitioners to deliver the best in home respiratory care to our patients. So we include things like home respiratory assessments, titrating oxygen levels, and deciding what works best for you if you are an oxygen patient. So just a word or two about understanding oxygen therapy, and I could spend an hour talking about this, but we're going to spend one slide's worth. So oxygen is colorless, odorless, tasteless gas that's essential for life. Once it's inhaled and into your bloodstream, your heart pumps the oxygen around because it's carried in your red blood cells, and it supplies the fuel or energy that we need to maintain life. That's a very broad standard definition. Oxygen is a controlled drug. I just had a conversation this morning with somebody asking why they can't purchase their own oxygen machine for themselves, and it's mainly because you need a prescription in order to use oxygen. Once you're done with your purchased oxygen canister or machine, we wouldn't want you passing that on to Aunt Sally or Uncle Charlie or find it in a garage sale. Okay, so that's why in the province of Ontario, and in fact in most places in Canada, you can't purchase oxygen equipment because it is required to be prescribed by a physician or a nurse practitioner. So the goals of oxygen therapy, you see that there, are to improve quality of life, minimize breathlessness, to reduce the strain or the work of breathing on your heart and your lungs, and to increase your blood oxygen levels. So let's take a look at a couple of the ways that we deliver oxygen in the community. You may be or may not be familiar with these. So we at Medigas offer a complete line of oxygen modalities to you. So it could be from low flow to high flow. So it's our job as healthcare professionals to figure out what works for you in the application that you need it at. And so that could range from anywhere from oxygen concentrators to portable oxygen concentrators, cylinders, liquid oxygen. My display at the back has a number of the portable oxygen concentrators that we'll talk about in a minute. But if we talk about just stationary oxygen units that, say, you would use in your home, the standard workhorse of our industry is the oxygen concentrator. So this is a device that it makes its own oxygen. It never needs to be refilled, doesn't need to be recharged. If we're talking about oxygen concentrators from a travel standpoint, we don't often talk about this. However, I have given some smaller, lighter units to some patients if they're traveling to multiple destinations, say on a road trip, and so they're staying overnight in various locations. I might give them a smaller oxygen concentrator that they can use when they're staying at friends or family's homes, in hotels, that sort of thing. So let's get to some of the other portable options for oxygen, and I'll start that off with this little illustration. Okay, the Oxy Dog. Okay, portability is not a competition, and I often find this to be the case with oxygen patients of mine. I'll hear people say to me, "Oh, I saw the oxygen machine that my neighbor has, and so I want that." Or I saw this ad somewhere, whether it's TV or magazine. It's a small little thing. It's got nice blinking lights. I want that. The first and primary thing when we're talking about oxygen modalities, especially for portability, is that we want to fit our oxygen patients with a device that's going to meet their needs. And we make a big deal of that at Medigas. We want to test you on it to make sure it's going to work for you. Just because it works for your neighbor doesn't mean that it's going to work for you. And secondly, if we're talking about travel, what kind of travel are you doing and the duration of your trip? Okay, that will make sense for you. OxyCat is also available. All right, so if we talk a little bit about portability, a good place to start is the whole debate between continuous flow and pulsing flow. Continuous flow is just what you think it is. It's constant flow of oxygen. And it fills your nasal oral pharynx, so that your nasal oral cavity, and gives you a little bit of a reservoir effect in here. That's why some people can use continuous flow options, but they can't use pulsing flow options. So what is pulsing flow? Well, you can see there it says it utilizes some kind of a conserver to deliver oxygen. It's based on your breathing and your inspiratory effort. So the delivery is more controlled, it's individualized, and when patients inhale, they quote unquote trigger the unit to release oxygen in puffs or pulses, or we call them boluses. So you're getting essentially a shot of oxygen when you take a breath in. Okay? So what that allows for is for me to give you a smaller, lighter device that tends to have an extended run time, so it's going to last longer for you. And all those are thumbs up kind of things for patients. They all love smaller, lighter, and things that last longer. Okay, so if somebody can tolerate a pulsing device, it's a good thing. So this is something that's very important to us. Not all of my competitors are doing this, but we want to make sure we test you on these devices to make sure, can you trigger the device? But not only can you trigger, are you getting enough oxygen? Even if you triggered it every breath, are you getting enough oxygen to make sure that you saturate properly, both at rest and exertion? And that's very, very important. And we're trying to mate up you with the kind of device that we want you to use in order to be, properly saturated, and you're not going to get into crisis wherever you may be traveling to. The other thing that's important to note here when we talk about pulse dosing is that if you're already on oxygen, the number that you use for continuous flow may not be the same number that you need to use for pulsing flow. So for instance, if you're on a 1 or a 2 liter per minute flow on continuous flow, you might still be able to use number 2 on any kind of pulsing device. But when we set the pulsing device on 1 or 2, you notice it doesn't say 1 or 2 LPM, liter per minute, because it's not a flow, it's a pulse, it's a bolus. So it approximates what 1 or 2 liters per minute might be, but it's not the same. So sometimes people need to use a higher pulsing number than they would normally use for continuous flow. And so that's important, and that's the job of the respiratory therapist or registered nurse from Medigas that comes in and assesses you to make sure that we're getting the right titration of flow. So it might mean a slight adjustment to your oxygen prescription. So let's take a look at a couple of these devices that do the sort of thing, and one is a transfill system. So the system on the left here, that's called the home fill system. This has been a huge winner in my area for people. People love the home fill system. So it's an oxygen concentrator and a filling station. The filling station uses oxygen from the concentrator to fill the tanks that are in the little carriage there on top on the filling station. So what this offers is I can give you much smaller tanks. One of them's on the table in the back there. The regulator is already incorporated into the cylinder, so you're not having to fumble with regulators on and off tanks all the time. And they easily fit into that top station. It's very, very easy to perform this task to fill your own cylinder. So you're filling your own tanks. Well, I only need to give you a couple of tanks. They last a very long time. For instance, a setting of 2 on a smaller tank like the one that's illustrated there will last you about 10 hours. Anybody on oxygen in the room goes, wow, 10 hours on one cylinder? Because that is a big deal. Because of the savings you're getting if you're able to pulse the tank. So these tanks also, though, can be either continuous flow or pulsing tanks. So let's get to everybody's favorite form of portability, and that's the portable oxygen concentrator. So we're talking about a smaller version of a standard oxygen concentrator. And things that come up when I start to profile these with patients are, because they've usually seen them in ads, or on printed ad format, is I bring it into their home. It's this sleek, sexy looking thing with blinking lights, and I turn it on, they go, oh my gosh, that thing is noisy. Well, yeah, it's a smaller version of your stationary concentrator, which is heavily insulated to, dampen down the noise of the compressor and the motor. In a small version like that, you're not going to get that same kind of noise muffling from the motor. But concentrators, POCs we call them, have gone a long way in terms of their noise and the kind of sense of noise that they offer when people are using them. So they're lightweight, they're simple to use, they can be run off batteries, AC or DC power. And just a note about DC power, if you are using one of these devices, I learned this the hard way when they first came out. If you're using this in your car off DC power, you should turn the car on first and then plug in the device. I had a fella, we blew all kinds of fuses in his car, took his car into Ford thinking that there was something wrong with his car, but it was just the way that the manufacturer hadn't stated that at this time. It was very early in the generation of these devices being on the market. And since they've changed their literature, the other thing that's important is you should try to plug it into the DC outlet that's closest to the engine block. You'll find, especially with, say, SUVs, there's power outlets all over the vehicle now, even in the back cabin space, but they don't draw as much power as the DC power outlet that's right in the dash, right by the engine block. So you should be plugging that in right there. Don't use your POC off the car battery if your car's not running. When would you do that? I had a fella go tenting, and he plugged in his POC overnight, and then he was stranded the next morning because the battery was totally drained. Okay, so don't do that. The engine should be running when you're using DC power off these devices. And it's good, important point here to note is that most POCs will not charge the battery when you're putting them into DC power. They only allow the unit to run. It won't drain your battery, but it also won't charge it. Now, there are a couple of newer models, such as the Sequel Eclipse 5 and the Oxygo, which are back there. They do actually charge your battery while they're plugged into the car, but most of them don't. So it's saving your battery, but it's not charging your battery. Needless to say, all these machines are very, very different. Battery duration times are going to last. They're very, very different for each one, and so that's part of us needing to fit you into the right product for what you're needing to do. So if we continue talking about this continuous flow versus pulsing flow idea, most POCs are solely pulsing devices, and most of them don't come with a continuous flow option, but there are a couple, the Simply Go and the Sequel Eclipse 5, that offer both pulsing and continuous flow options. So if we take a look here, the continuous flow option obviously offers a constant, steady flow. The maximum flow available, though, is still fairly low. It's 3 liters, and there's only one machine that does that, which is the Sequel Eclipse 5. It's recommended for those people who really can't trigger pulsing, or if you're going somewhere and you're sleeping over. This is a very important point. You cannot use pulsing flow if you're sleeping. Why? Because you go to sleep, your mouth goes open and you stop triggering because it's not sensing at your nose, you're breathing through your mouth. So that means you're not getting any oxygen if you're using a pulsing device. So a unit that has both continuous flow and pulsing options are good for, say, road trips, because you can use the pulsing during the day, you can use the continuous flow option during the night, but keep in mind, depending on what your prescription is, the options really are fairly limited, only 2 to 3 liters per minute continuous flow. And these units are typically bigger because they need to be more robust to support that continuous flow option, so they're about 10 to 15 pounds. If you look at the pulse dose option, which most I said POCs are, they're more sensitive, they're patient controlled, they have extended battery lives because of that, and if you can make them trigger, then you can use them, and they're typically smaller and lighter for you. Okay, let's talk about airline travel with oxygen. The first thing I'll say about airline travel is if you're currently on oxygen, the flows that you use here on the ground may be different than the flows that you need up in the air, right? Cabin pressure in the air is about 8,000 feet. So imagine you climbing a mountain 8,000 feet and you're oxygen dependent. You're probably going to need more oxygen because the partial pressure, the amount of oxygen in the air, is less at that elevation. And I've even had some people that don't require oxygen here on the ground that they get up in the air and they should be having oxygen. So the question always arises, well, how do I know? How do I know if I need oxygen? That's definitely a conversation for you to have with either your respiratory professional like myself and or your physician. I would say if your saturations, your oxygen readings are borderline when you do some kind of activity, or even especially if they're borderline at rest, but if they're borderline or they decrease when you exert, even though you're not exerting on the plane, the partial pressure of oxygen will probably dictate that, yeah, you're going to need some oxygen in the air. So when traveling with oxygen on board an aircraft, POCs are usually the preferred choice, okay? They don't usually let cylinders on board anymore. 9/11 changed everything when it comes to this, especially with oxygen and airline travel. Airlines will not let you bring your own oxygen cylinders on board anymore because they really can't verify what's in them. I checked this week with Air Canada's website, and you can buy their cylinders, which look exactly like your cylinders, but they won't let you bring your cylinders on. You can buy cylinders from Air Canada, and the program for this costs you between $220 to $1,070, depending on how long your flight is and what your flow rate is. So that should be a non-starter for anybody in the room, okay? You do not want to do that. That's an exorbitant cost for anybody. You're usually allowed to bring on some form of POC. So when we talk about advance notice here, what we're talking about is I always advise patients, when you're booking your airline tickets, in the process of booking them, so before you pay your money, you need to tell the airline you're going to need oxygen. So you need to know whether you need oxygen before you book that flight. And all the airline websites that I checked said you still need to double back with the airline at least 48 hours before your departure. So even though you bought your ticket, they know that you're using oxygen. 2 days before you leave, you should be checking in with the airline saying, hey, it's me. I'm on oxygen. You're going to need to make some kind of special provision possibly for me. So that's very important. Remember, you need to travel with your doctor's order for oxygen. I would advise if you're traveling out of country, you should get a letter from your home oxygen provider to say, yep, I'm a home oxygen patient with this vendor. This is all legit. I'm not trying to smuggle anything into an oxygen concentrator machine or anything like that. You should be doing that to be sure. There is a list usually on an airline's website of the approved types of devices that you can use. And in fact, this is a list from WestJet that I just essentially copied and pasted onto the slide here. So you can see that the options are really numerous for types of devices that you can use. Points to remember here, though. Airlines will tell you in their section about traveling with oxygen that the battery power that you need to have needs to be at least 1.5 to 2 times the duration of your flight, or sometimes they say your flight time plus 3 hours. So for instance, if your flight is 2 hours long, you're going to need enough batteries to power that POC for between 4 to 5 hours. So if you're taking a flight from here to Vancouver, that can start to be a bit of a problem, or especially if you're going transcontinental. Most airlines will state that you can only run your POC on its battery power in flight. Even though there's seats now that you can buy that have power outlets, either DC or AC, for some reason they don't want you using them. So I don't know why they exist. But anyway, if you're going to run your POC, it has to be on battery power. So you need to be able to take enough batteries to suffice for that. And of course, in the event of delays and things like that too. And you need to be able to fit your POC under the seat in front of you. So it needs to be small and compact enough in order to be able to do that. And those extra POC batteries that you're going to carry, you can't put those in checked luggage. They need to be with you in your carry-on because you might need to use them, right? And if you tried to check them, I was interested to hear this from WestJet. If you check batteries into your luggage, they're considered dangerous goods because they're lithium-ion. And now you need all kinds of paperwork to go with them, so that's just a hassle. So the batteries, the extra batteries you need to take have to be on your carry-on. This is a chart from the SQL Eclipse people. It's kind of busy, but essentially what it is telling you how many batteries you might need if you're using their device for travel. Now keep in mind, these numbers are just for travel. They're not for time in the airport or what the airlines are saying that you need to have at least double what your flight time is. But you can see here, for instance, if your flight length is 2 hours and you're on a flow of 2 continuous, you'd need 2 batteries for that flight. Even though this pulse dose mode is in milliliters here on the y-axis, so if you're on, say, 40 mils, which I think is something like a setting of 2, and you're on a 4-hour flight, well, now you need 2 batteries, but really you're going to need 4 batteries. So, having all these extra batteries can be cumbersome. They're heavy. And they're fairly costly. One battery for the SQL Eclipse, which you see down here, one of those batteries costs $500. You need 4 of them. That's quite an investment. Now, for home care companies like mine, we don't make you buy those batteries per se, unless you're going to be using them all the time. If you're just taking a trip for the holidays, we will rent you those batteries, but there usually is an extra cost for that, okay? Just to be advised for that, because the airlines are dictating that you need to have so much extra battery power with you. So Medigas has a program called Portability. And, like I had mentioned earlier, remember, we have over 70 locations across the country. So we're in virtually every province to be able to help with consistency of care. Remember, if you're a Medigas patient and you're traveling to most provinces, we know you. We know your oxygen prescription. We know what device you normally use. We know what your flow rate is. We just know you as a customer. And so that often will put people's minds at ease that they're not having to kind of reinvent the wheel with some other oxygen company when they're just traveling across the country. For most companies, though, and I can say this for most of my competitors, we don't have offices or Medigases in the U.S. So you would need to find another provider if you're traveling to the U.S. or most other countries. But most of them are more than happy to help you out. So in a little bit of a summary here, in preparation for your trip, you should be doing these things, right? You need to plan ahead for all these things. Whether you're going on a road trip or you're taking a plane trip, the earlier you tell your home oxygen provider about that, the easier everything is going to be for us to be able to mobilize equipment or extra equipment for you. Consult your doctor, get a copy of your oxygen prescription, especially if you're crossing a border. Complete that travel itinerary to note what special arrangements you might need for oxygen therapy, and then reconfirm those arrangements, especially if you're flying before you're leaving. Okay? I won't spend much time about funding for home oxygen other than to tell you, because that would be another half-hour presentation about that, but in most provinces there is funding available, and most of you, if you're on home oxygen, you're probably not paying for it. The government of Ontario is paying for it. Okay, so that's available. If you don't have that, then a lot of private insurance will help with paying for the cost of oxygen. They may not totally cover it, but they might cover some of it for you. But a little tip here, If you're traveling out of country and you're incurring other oxygen costs, because like I said, there's no Medigas in Switzerland or the US or wherever you're headed, you can request from your home oxygen vendor to get reimbursed for the amount of time that you were away, for the amount of funding that you would have been eligible for. Okay, so for instance, if you're away for a month, the amount that the home oxygen program, government program, allows us to charge for oxygen per month is $405. So if you incurred $400 cost for the month that you're away, you can ask for that from your home oxygen vendor, and they're obliged to give it to you. Okay, if you're away for 2 weeks and you spend $400, you can't ask for $400. You can ask for 2, but you can't ask for 4. Okay, you kind of get it. So that extra little bit of reimbursement for patients is definitely available for you, depending on what your travel arrangements are. And then I'll just say, at Medigas, we have a long history of being experts at this kind of thing. And we do a lot of traveling. You can imagine I'm the guy in Simcoe, Muskoka, so in the summer, boy, oh boy, there's lots of traveling going on. So we deal with this all the time. That's our number there, if you needed any help with your oxygen needs. I'll take any burning questions you have now. Or it's lunch, depending on what.
It looks like we have one question over here.
Talked about people who might not be on oxygen currently,
Mm-hmm.
but if they have borderline SATs, O2 SATs on exertion, they may need, if flying. What's borderline O2 SAT? What does that mean? Is it low 90s? Is it high 80s? What is that?
Yeah, I would say kind of around the 90% mark. We usually say anything over 90% oxygen saturation is in normal range. But especially if we did a bit of a walk test with you and hey, you dip to like 89, 88, 87, even though those are only differences of 2 or 3%, the effect of that is much greater than just 2 or 3%. So there's added strain there on your heart and lungs. And yeah, we get you up in the air with that extra pressurization in the cabin and lower partial pressure of oxygen. That could be a problem. Any other questions at all? Okay, thank you very much.